Okay, brilliant. Okay, so the paper that I've chosen is called Rewarding Approach Behaviour Attenuates the Return of Pain-Related Avoidance After Successful Extinction with Response Prevention, by a whole lot of, I think, Dutch researchers. It was published just this December. And that's a very complicated title. And you might wonder what on earth it has got to do with pain. So the background is it is an open access paper, like I said, published in December 2023. It looks at acute pain in healthy young adult subjects, and it relates to exposure therapy for persistent pain, possibly. Okay, so does it have implications for treatments of persistent pain and self-management? If you sort of think about that while we're talking. Okay. So this is how they introduce this subject. When people have successful exposure treatment for chronic pain, they increase function and sometimes decrease pain by, say, biograded exposure techniques. And a flare-up of pain can result in an increase in fear and avoidance behaviour, which is called a relapse. This team explored two things that they thought might affect the return of fear and avoidance: cognitive load and rewarding approach behaviour. They describe this as chronic pain disability is maintained by a vicious cycle of pain-related fear and avoidance, and often managed with exposure treatment, which aims at restoring functioning even if pain persists. During exposure, people with chronic pain perform feared activities and movements, e.g. bending to lift a heavy object, to challenge their catastrophic harm beliefs, e.g. when I bend to lift a heavy object, my spine will snap. To prevent misattributions of safety behaviours, e.g. bending with the back straight, are often forbidden during exposure with response prevention. Exposure for chronic pain is effective, but long-term treatment outcomes could be improved by considering factors that modulate relapse. So by relapse, they're talking about the return of, not a return of pain, but a return of the fear and avoidance behaviours related to that pain. So exposure therapy is based on behavioural learning theory and is based on the person in pain learning a new safety memory that supersedes and inhibits the old fear avoidance memory. This part of the process is known as extinction. However, the old fear avoidance memory or habit is still there underlying, and maintaining the new safety memory or habit requires concerted effort on the part of the person. So the old fear avoidance memory habit might return after a period of time or after a pain flare-up, which is known as relapse. They suggest that in times of stress, people would revert to the old habitual forms of memory or habit, and thus behaviour, as they use less effort or have less headspace. So this mental stress is known as cognitive load. When we have something to do that we like or place value on, we know that this can reduce our attention on and our negative experience of pain. This is why we tell people to do fun stuff and, value activities. We make more effort to do it, and we might be more likely to do it even if it triggers pain. These guys are calling this a reward. This study aimed to investigate if cognitive load and reward modulated the return of fear and pain-related avoidance after extinction. So once exposure therapy had worked and that you weren't doing the avoidance behaviour and your fear had reduced. So for the experiment, they had 88 healthy young participants, and they split them into three groups. The low load group, which is the cognitive load that they were testing, the high load of cognitive, and the reward group. And these are the numbers, so they were split fairly evenly there. Prior sampling suggested that 66 participants were needed to detect a large effect in the main analysis. So that's any sort of big improvement. Design, it was to move a robotic arm to do a task while at times experiencing pain. So you move this robotic arm connected to the computer to do a task, and the arm was to move one of three paths from a start point to an end point. I'll show you this in a second. T1 is labelled the shortest and least effortful path, T2 the medium distance and medium effort, T3 the furthest distance and most effort. All the while doing a digit test, so remembering 5 numbers that are heard during the task and repeating them back in your as you've remembered them afterwards. So the low cognitive load would be the same number 5 times, and the high cognitive load would be 5 different numbers. So this is, I found the thing that they use, the robotic arms. I just thought you'd like to see this a little bit. Chris, can you sort of give me a thumbs up if you can hear the sound?
Welcome to the world of realistic visual and haptic feedback. Introducing a powerful platform for human-machine interaction, Motec's Haptic Master VR. A robot designed to provide a realistic sense of touch in a virtual or remote world. An endless opportunity platform for developing your own haptic or human movement research. With only limited workspace needed, the Haptic Master offers 3 active degrees of freedom: up and down movement, flexion, and vertical axis rotation. Advanced engineering delivers 0 mechanical friction via a sophisticated admittance control paradigm, creating unprecedented haptic worlds, ranging from highly delicate movement to strong force exertion. The Haptic Master generates these haptic effects through virtual objects, such as mass spring dampers and dynamic force fields.
So that just gives you a sense of what they were using to do this. And this is their description of what the task is. And as I said, it's a bit complex. So I made my own. So basically, they just had a little computer task where you had to move the arm to move a ball or something from the start point to the end point. This is T1, T2, and T3. So T1 is the shortest route, like that. T2, slightly longer, and T3, longer still. Okay, but the pain that was induced in them was a small electric shock to the triceps tendon. They decided to do this in the practice session. They determined it on an 11-point scale. So they basically shocked them until they went, ow, that's enough. And each individual decided their own level, which was set to be rather painful and demands some effort to tolerate. So everybody was sort of determining their own pain, which is interesting. So when was the pain induced? The participants would do the robotic arm task with the 3 route options available, and pain would occur at this distribution. So T1, which is the shortest route, would have pain 80% of the time. T2, medium distance and medium effort, would have pain 60% of the time. And T3 never had any pain. So 80%, 60%, and no. The reward that they offered was a lottery prize of €100 value, but was pre-chosen from a selection by the participant, which was to ensure that it had a value to them. Every participant in all the groups was entered into the lottery with 10 chances. The reward group were incentivized for approach behaviour, which basically just means doing the one that hurt more, with an increased chance of winning 2 more entries each time they did the movement that had an increased chance of pain. The reward group were given this information during the experiment, not previous to it. So the experiment had several stages: practice, where they learned the task, so it wasn't new to them; the acquisition phase, which is learning that some movements can hurt; the extinction phase, which is learning that those movements no longer triggered pain; the reinstatement manipulation phase, which was just them sitting not doing the task, and they had a random pain a couple of times. And the reward group at this point were told that they will get this increased chance of reward if they do the most likely painful movement. And then there was a test phase. So they did the task, but with no pain added. And then they did the task again with the same pain likelihood as in the acquisition phase. And all the time when they did the actual task, they were also doing the digit tests. It's quite sort of complex for them. So the digit test is used to mimic cognitive load. So the harder the test, the more cognitive load the participant experiences. During the start of the movement task, 5 numbers are played to the participant and they are asked to recall these and repeat them back at the end of the task. So the low load had 5 identical numbers. The high load had 5 different numbers. And the reward group also had the high load numbers. So the low load group is basically the control group. So this is just my little sort of thing of how the experiment was. So you see, they practice first, no pain, then the acquisition phase, where they do the movement in the digit test, and the pain is there on that distribution. Then the extinction phase, where they do the movement in the digit test, and they only actually do the T1. The other 2 were blocked off, but there was no pain. Then you had the little gap where there were no movements, and the reward group were told that they would get this extra chance of the lottery ticket, and they had unsignaled pain twice. Then we had the reinstatement phase, and this is the test phase, where the movement and digit test with no pain, but with all 3 options. And the reacquisition, where they did the movement and the digit test with the 3 options, and the pain distribution was the same. So they obviously had to do some measures. So avoidance behaviours were measured mechanically because you knew whether they chose T1, T2, or T3. Fear and pain expectancy was self-reported, and they used the questions: how afraid would you be if you would move through the yellow arch, T1, now? To what extent do you expect an electrical stimulus if you would move through the yellow arch now? And they gave them a rating. The digit test performance was expressed as a percentage. If they got all the digits right, it was correct. They also did some psychological trait questionnaires, which are the usual sort of ones that we use in this. And they actually discovered there's no group differences for that. So it's just an extra bit. So the results. They did lots of statistical shenanigans, which I have no interest in, but or very complicated. And they came up with that there are no group differences for age, gender, or any of the psychological questionnaire scores, which is good. So it's a fairly even bunch. There were no group differences for pain. So remember, they chose their intensity or the self-reported pain intensity or pain unpleasantness. So that again is another interesting finding. The low load group reported less difficulty doing the digit task, as you would hope, and the low load group performed better than the high load. There were no difference between the high load group and the reward group. They were both doing the more complex cognitive load, all of which is confirming that the cognitive load test worked as intended. So in acquisition, they found that all groups acquired pain-related avoidance behaviour and pain-related fear and pain expectancy, which you'd understand. You know, if it's going to hurt you to do T1, you start to avoid it. That's what pain is for. So there was an increased use of T3. There was no difference between the 3 groups. So extinction is a prerequisite for testing the return of fear. And this was successful extinction of pain-related fear and pain expectancy for T1 in all 3 groups was reported. So that was good. So they stopped being afraid of using T1 because there was no longer pain. So that was good. So they then looked at the avoidance behaviour. So all groups demonstrated increased avoidance behaviour in the test phase, indicating that pain-related avoidance returns after an unexpected pain flare-up. The increase was similar for both low and high load groups, suggesting that the return of avoidance is not necessarily enhanced when one is under increased cognitive load. This wasn't necessarily what they were expecting. The reward group demonstrated less return than both low and high group, indicating that being rewarded to perform a previously pain-related task indeed dampens the return of pain-related avoidance. So even though it hurts, you'll still do it because it's worth it, because you're getting a reward. Pain-related fear. all groups reported higher fear for T1 at the beginning of the test phase compared to the end of the extinction phase. So this is after they'd been given the 2 extra shocks, which sort of reminded them that T1 hurt. The increase was similar in all groups, so this suggests that relapse has occurred. Fear for T1 increased further after the second section of the test phase, which is when the pain was reintroduced. This was the same for the low and high load groups, and slightly lower for the reward group. But when they did the statistical analysis, it wasn't statistically significant. So this suggests that fear of pain is not significantly mitigated by reward. So summary of the results. The low load, the control group, showed increased pain-related fear and avoidance. High load group showed similar increase of pain-related fear and avoidance. This suggests relapse is not more likely when cognitive resources are scarcer. This challenges previous findings, so potential that the digit task isn't demanding enough, they suggest. And pursuing a reward did inhibit the return of pain-related avoidance, but not pain-related fear. And they note that there's a growing body of evidence that suggests a divergent relationship between fear and avoidance, which is quite interesting and something that we might want to look at later on in journal club. So they go on to discuss their findings, and they suggest that long-term outcomes of exposure treatment may be improved if competitive or approach behaviours are established to dampen the return of pain-related avoidance. So people living with persistent pain might be motivated to perform movements that were once feared if they are now embedded with meaningful activities. Using the positive reinforcement of valued activities to dampen the return on pain-related avoidance compared to the negative reinforcement of pain avoidance. They looked at their cognitive load results, which they weren't expecting. And they noted that they'd used 5 digits as there wasn't enough time in doing the task for 6. And there was a differential between low and high load. And this is only a proxy measure, so it's not real life. So these were healthy volunteers with only sporadic acute pain. So results might not generalize to people living with persistent pain, which is functionally different. So people living with persistent pain are also older on average, so may respond differently to cognitive load manipulation. They also note that the sample size is sufficient to detect large effects, so a more moderate effect might not be picked up. The summary is that this experiment successfully replicated the return of pain-related fear and avoidance after an unexpected pain flare-up, and demonstrated that the return of avoidance, but not fear, is attenuated when one is rewarded for performing a previously pain-associated movement. Importantly, also after pain is reintroduced. There are potential clinical implications as it suggests that outcomes of exposure treatment for persistent pain may be better retained when people are performing valued activities. More research is needed to clarify if these findings are applicable in actual clinical practice. And I just wanted to add a personal note. Some of you, most of you, I don't know that I have trigeminal neuralgia, and I was severely disabled for 17 years with it. And I had major pain triggers. I was unable to go outside without scarves and masks on because the wind and the rain would trigger severe pain. So I used to wear masks, as you can see in that picture there. Surprisingly difficult to find pictures of me with my scarves and masks on, but there you go. But anyway, once I sort of started to recover and was using sort of modern pain science as the foundation of that, I deconditioned these triggers using graded exposure and positive reinforcement. However, the type of positive reinforcement I used was more immediate than used in this experiment. So what I did is I did graded exposure. So I slowly increased the amount of time I had my scarf open to the wind for this example. All the while doing safety talk, so reassuring myself I was safe, that there was no harm occurring, and making sure I was self-soothing. And then before I put the scarf back on it, immediately I gave myself a jelly bean or a bit of chocolate just before the scarf made, so click and treat. I was basically training myself like you would do a dog or a horse. So this paper obviously is a different kind of reward. It's a more sort of cognitive reward. It's more of a reward in the future, and it's a variable reward. So I was just wondering you know, how and why that was different. So it made me think that I probably did gain a reward, because by not having to wear the masks, my life was better and I was doing more valued activities without the coverings and more likely to go outside. And that this is reliant on the fact that humans can use logic and see a variable future reward as salient, because the reward to work has to mean something, it has to have value. But I'm just wondering now what this experiment would have been like if they'd also been given you know, a salient immediate reward as you would an animal, and whether that would have made an interesting sort of addition to it. But I don't know, depends what you guys think. And so that's me done. I don't think I went on for too long.
That was absolutely wonderful, Niki. Thank you so much. And you know, it was very, very thorough.